The first time I saw him, he was barely more than a shadow in the dirt, a trembling outline against the sun-bleached grass. A frayed rope looped around his tiny, trembling body, dragging behind him like a silent chain of old grief. His paws kicked at the hard earth, and every step seemed an act of defiance against a world that had already weighed him down. He looked back at us, not with anger, not with fear, but with a fragile, searching hope, as if he could see in our eyes the difference between pain and rescue. The wind whispered through the fields, carrying dust and the faint tang of wet fur, and I felt my chest tighten in ways I hadn't expected. There was a story in those eyes, a quiet urgency in that backward glance that made time slow. I wanted to reach out, to break the rope, to carry him into a place where the world would finally make sense for him again. Show your love, hit like, share, and subscribe for more. The sun hung low and merciless over the field, turning the grass into brittle gold and painting the horizon in sharp streaks of light that cut across the dusty earth. The wind whispered faintly through the stalks, carrying with it the scent of sun-baked soil, dry leaves, and something faintly pungent, fur that had known neglect. That's when I saw him. At first he was just a dark blur, a quivering shape that did not belong to the field's calm emptiness. Then I noticed the rope, frayed and knotted, trailing behind him like a scar on the land. Each step he took seemed weighted, measured as though the earth itself resisted his movement. And my chest tightened in ways I hadn't expected. He paused mid-step, shaking slightly, and I could see the tension in the curve of his spine, the flick of his ears pinned against his head. His eyes met mine, large, glistening pools of fragile hope, and I felt a strange, hollow ache open in my chest. He looked back at us again, tilting his small head, and I could feel the hesitation in his gaze. There was no anger there, no bitterness, only a quiet, desperate question, the kind that reaches past language. Will you save me, or leave me here like all the others? The rope scraped across stones, producing a hollow, uneven sound that made the field feel impossibly empty and silent. His paws, small and dirty, kicked up clouds of dust that hung in the golden light like fleeting spirits, each grain catching the sun before drifting lazily to the ground. I knelt instinctively, letting the earth meet me at his level, the rough texture of the soil pressing into my palms, grounding me, making the moment tangible, visceral. I whispered his name, not expecting a response, yet hoping he would sense it through the vibration of the air, through the sincerity of my intent. The first steps toward him were agonizingly slow. He darted sideways, ears flicking to every sound, the distant call of a crow, the rustle of dry stalks, the faint hum of insects hidden in the ground. His nose twitched furiously, catching every scent, and for a moment I realized the depth of his wariness. This was no ordinary hesitation. It was the imprint of survival. The rope that had tethered him seemed to carry all his memories of confinement, of struggle, of nights spent shivering alone under indifferent stars. He took a small step forward, paused, then retreated a fraction, dragging the frayed cord like a remnant of a past he could not yet leave behind. I crouched lower, heart hammering, trying not to make any sudden movements, letting the silence stretch between us. The field around him felt enormous, almost threatening, as though every blade of grass were an obstacle, every shadow a predator. Yet, despite his small, fragile frame, there was something unyielding in the way he lifted his head, flicked his tail ever so slightly, and studied us. The sunlight caught the tips of his fur, making it glimmer like dusted bronze, though it was patchy and coarse in places, a testament to nights spent without warmth or comfort. Each inhale brought the scent of wet earth and dry dust, mingled with the faint musk of fear and hunger. I felt my stomach twist, a mixture of sorrow, anger, and an urgent need to act that made my hand shake. Then he paused entirely, ears pricked, nose raised, eyes narrowing as he calculated the distance between our presence and his own fragile body. I could see every muscle in his small form tense, his paws gripping the dirt, claws pressing shallow furrows into the hard earth. It was as if he were weighing the world's dangers against the possibility of trust. The rope tugged slightly against him, a silent reminder that he had never known freedom without restriction, that each movement carried a history of restraint. And yet, even with that weight, there was a glimmer of curiosity in his gaze, a tentative hope that maybe, just maybe, the humans watching him meant something different than those who had come before. I inched forward, keeping my hands open, fingers extended like an offering. My voice soft and low, a whisper carried on the warm breeze. He sniffed the air, hesitant, body quivering but unmoving. Each second stretched, long and fragile, as if the world had contracted to the distance between us. The rope scraped again against a hidden stone, producing a sound that made him flinch, and I froze, willing him to move at his own pace. He shifted slightly, then looked back at me, tilting his head with cautious intelligence, a silent acknowledgement of my presence, a fragile permission to continue. Finally, he took a step closer, and the world seemed to hold its breath. Dust rose in lazy spirals around his paws as the sunlight caught the faint sheen of sweat on his tiny, trembling body. I could see the rise and fall of his chest, rapid but controlled, the faint quiver of his tail as he tested the air. His eyes never left mine, and in them I saw a story of nights spent alone, of hunger, of fear, of chains that dug into skin and spirit alike. And yet, there was still hope. A fragile, shimmering thread of hope that I felt tug against my own heart. I spoke again, whispering promises I wasn't sure I could fulfill, and he responded in the smallest of gestures. A slight shift forward, a tentative nudge of his nose toward my hand. The rope dragged behind him, slackening slightly as if sensing the change in the atmosphere. I felt tears prick my eyes, unbidden, as I reached out, letting my fingers hover above him without touch, giving him space to decide. The sun dipped lower, painting the horizon in ribbons of amber and pink, and the field seemed to exhale with us, the tension dissolving into the warm evening air. He stepped again, closer now, paws sinking slightly into the softening dirt, fur brushing against my sleeve in a tentative connection that carried more weight than words ever could. In that moment, I realized that the rope was more than a physical tether. It was a symbol of everything he had endured, everything he had survived. And yet, with every cautious inch forward, he was choosing something new. The possibility of trust, the possibility of connection, the possibility of a life beyond pain. The sun touched his fur, and for the first time it caught the glint of resilience, of unspoken courage. I whispered once more, a soft affirmation, and he lingered, nose nudging my palm, eyes glimmering with the faintest spark of relief. The wind carried the scent of earth, dust, and freedom, and in that suspended moment, the world held only us, the tethered shadow and the hands that reached to free him. And then with one final glance back, he stepped fully into the space between fear and hope, the rope dragging faintly but no longer binding his spirit. The field, once harsh and empty, seemed to soften around us, the light catching in patches of gold, highlighting every tremor of his small frame. In that glance, I understood that this was only the beginning of a story, a journey that would stretch across days, weeks, perhaps years. But in that fragile, heart-stopping moment, there was a promise that the tether could be broken and the shadow could walk into sunlight. The next morning, the field lay beneath a pale, trembling light, dew clinging to each blade of grass like fragile jewels, and the world smelled of wet earth and the faint tang of sun-warmed fur. The puppy was there, a small, cautious shadow among the stalks, rope long gone, but the memory of it still etched into the rhythm of his steps. He moved with care, head low, ears flicked back, eyes scanning every corner, every rustle, as though danger was embedded in the very air. I followed quietly, letting the silence stretch, letting him define the pace, letting the field itself dictate the space between us. Each heartbeat echoed too loudly in my chest. Every subtle twitch of his body seemed magnified, each pause loaded with the weight of a past he could not yet forget. The sun rose slowly, painting the mist in soft golden tones, and the world felt suspended between night and day, fear and trust. He paused at a patch of damp earth, nostrils flaring, and lowered his nose to the ground. I could see the tension coiled in his body, the slight curve of his spine, the rigid set of his tiny paws, the faint tremble of his tail. His eyes flicked toward me, darting, assessing, measuring whether I belonged to the world of safety or the one that had left him tethered and alone. I crouched low, hands hovering loosely, fingers trembling slightly, careful not to invade his fragile space. I spoke softly, whispering gentle encouragements, letting my voice ride on the faint morning breeze. The sound seemed to catch his attention, and for the first time, he lifted his head fully, nostrils twitching, ears pricked forward just enough to hint at curiosity. It took several moments before he took a single step closer. Each movement was cautious, deliberate, a silent negotiation of trust between us. The dew glinted on his fur, highlighting the thin patches where the sun had never warmed him enough to heal properly, and the small, sharp rise of his ribs reminded me of nights without food, nights without comfort. Every inch he moved forward was a triumph of courage over instinct, every tentative paw fall, a quiet declaration of hope. I whispered again, letting the words form a rhythm with a gentle rustle of leaves and the distant call of a waking bird. And he moved just slightly, a hesitant approach that carried the weight of both fear and longing. The environment itself seemed to respond to this delicate exchange. A gentle wind rippled through the grass, bending stalks toward him as if urging him forward. Sunlight broke through thin clouds, spilling in golden patches across the field, warming his fur and revealing the subtle shimmer of trembling muscles beneath. The faint scent of wet earth mingled with his own faint musk, creating a tangible link between us, a shared atmosphere that seemed to say, "We are here together now, and maybe that is enough to begin." I remained still, letting the moment breathe, aware that even the smallest gesture, an outstretched hand, a soft word, a blink of recognition, carried monumental weight. He stopped suddenly, ears flicking to a distant snap of a twig, eyes wide and alert. His body froze, a perfect balance of tension and fear. The world seemed to contract around us, the dew-damp earth, the rustling stalks, the distant hum of life, all amplified in the crucible of this moment. I froze with him, sensing the delicate thread between curiosity and retreat. Then, after a long measured pause, he nudged forward again, a small trembling step, nose hovering just above my hand. His tail twitched ever so slightly, a whisper of intention, of tentative trust, and I felt a pang of relief so sharp it caught in my throat. Slowly, I extended my hand further, palm open and steady. The air was heavy with anticipation, each heartbeat measured against the soft sounds of the field waking. He sniffed the air, paw lifted mid-step, body coiled with tension, and then hesitated. I could feel the history of chains, of confinement, of nights shivering alone, pressing down on him, making even this simple act monumental. My voice remained soft, almost breathless, calling to him not as a command, but as a promise. And after what felt like eternity, he inched forward, brushing the tip of his nose against my fingers. It was a fleeting, electric connection, but it carried everything: fear, relief, hope, and the quiet recognition that he was not alone. Once contact was made, the world seemed to exhale. The puppy trembled, muscles quivering as he tested the reality of safety. His eyes, wide and glistening, flicked to mine, seeking affirmation, reassurance, permission to continue. I whispered again, letting my words trace a path through the golden light, and he responded inch by inch by inch, paw by paw, moving closer until he pressed against my hand with tentative trust. The wind carried the faint scent of grass and damp earth. The sun highlighted the subtle quiver of his tiny frame, and I could feel the fragile bond forming, one measured in pauses, breaths, and glances rather than words. The field had shifted with him. Shadows retreated, light pooled around our connection, and the faint hum of insects and rustling leaves became a quiet symphony, celebrating the tentative bridge between fear and trust. Each movement he made was deliberate, as if testing the limits of a world he had only known in fragments. Every glance back, every flick of his ears, spoke of a past that had hurt him, of boundaries learned the hard way, but also of a courage quietly emerging. And I remained still and patient, a steady presence in the fragile architecture of his awakening. Finally, he stepped fully into the space between doubt and belief, nose brushing against my palm, ears raised slightly, the tail relaxed in the subtlest sign of surrender. He allowed himself to feel safety for the first time. The dew-damp earth, the warmth of the sun, the golden shimmer of morning light. It all became part of his realization that the world could be something different, something gentle. I breathed slowly, matching his rhythm, letting the tension of the past release, aware that this was only the beginning. The rope that once tethered him was gone, but its memory lingered, a shadow of history that he was learning to navigate, inch by inch, trust by trust. And then, in a moment both small and monumental, he nudged fully against me, paw pressing into the soil as if grounding himself in the reality of connection, eyes soft, glimmering, filled with cautious hope. The world was wide, full of unknowns, yet he had chosen to take a step toward us. And I, kneeling in dew and light, understood that the bond had begun, not in grand gestures, but in hesitation, patience, and the delicate reaching across fear, The field, once a place of isolation and struggle, had become a bridge. In the quiet hum of morning, with sunlight falling softly on trembling fur and an outstretched hand, a new chapter of life had begun. One measured in trust, in breath, in the slow, unwavering courage of a small, fragile soul daring to reach. The afternoon sun filtered through the trees, painting long golden streaks across the damp earth, and for the first time he moved without hesitation, yet every step was cautious, measured, as though he were learning the rhythm of freedom one paw at a time. The rope was gone, but its memory lingered in his gait, a subtle hesitation that made each movement deliberate, careful, almost sacred. He sniffed at the grass, lifted a paw to test the solidity of the earth, then glanced back at me, eyes wide and searching. There was trust in that glance, fragile and unspoken, but also uncertainty. The field, once a vast expanse of threat, had become a canvas of possibility, and every blade of grass, every shadow, every rustle of leaves seemed to whisper, "You can belong here." I crouched a few paces away, letting him set the pace, letting him define the boundary between caution and curiosity. Each soft step he took sent faint tremors through the soil, dew clinging to his paws as he tested the world around him. Sunlight caught the wet sheen of his fur, highlighting every subtle ripple of muscles beneath, a testament to his nervous energy and growing confidence. Stopped suddenly, ears flicking to a distant crow, nose twitching as he sniffed the breeze, then slowly lowered himself into the grass, a gesture of tentative exploration. I watched, breath held, aware that any sudden movement from me could undo the fragile bridge we had begun to build. Tentatively, he inched closer, nudging a small stick with his nose. His tail twitched once lightly, and I could see the moment of internal debate flicker across his features, the balance between caution and curiosity, between fear and the instinctive urge to play. The rope had gone, but the imprint of restraint remained. His movements were deliberate, measured, each step a negotiation with himself and with the world around him. I whispered softly, letting my voice ride the gentle wind that carried the scent of wet soil and sun-warmed fur. Paused, ears tilting, then nudged the stick again, and a faint, almost imperceptible tail wag betrayed the spark of excitement that lay beneath the surface. We moved together through the field, letting him dictate the rhythm. Each blade of grass pressed against his belly. Each patch of sunlight fell across his back like a gentle hand, and the world seemed to contract to this delicate dance of trust and tentative freedom. I offered my hand again, this time for him to brush against, to feel the warmth and steadiness of a presence that would not hurt him. He sniffed cautiously, pressed his tiny body against my fingers for the briefest moment, and then pulled back slightly, only to test again. Repetition was a ritual of growing assurance, a silent communication of "I can trust you, but I am still learning." As he explored, I noticed the smallest details that spoke of both trauma and resilience. Faint scars on his tiny legs, the slight patchiness of his fur, the uneven length of his nails, all told stories of nights spent without shelter, of scratches from rough terrain, of hunger and fear. Yet in the same body, there was life, energy, and a stubborn determination to move forward despite everything. He sniffed a damp patch of earth, then lifted his head and met my gaze, eyes glimmering with a mixture of wonder and cautious expectation. Sunlight warmed him, and for the first time it seemed to illuminate not just his fur, but the resilience in his spirit. I knelt beside him, letting him brush against my legs, his small body shivering in the faint breeze that stirred the leaves above. Each interaction was a negotiation, a lesson in patience and presence. I moved slowly, letting him decide how close to come, when to approach, and when to retreat. And he responded in kind, pushing the boundaries of trust with tiny, deliberate steps. His tail twitched more freely now, ears lifted slightly, and a soft, hesitant bark escaped him when he discovered a small patch of sunlight he could roll in. The sound was unpracticed, almost musical in its uncertainty, but it carried a joy that had been absent in the rope-tethered days of his life. Hours passed like this, each moment a layer in the fragile architecture of connection. I noticed how he began to pause less, how his glances back became fewer and braver, how his body stretched more freely as he tested the limits of this newfound space. The wind rustled the leaves above us, birds called intermittently, and the faint hum of insects drifted through the warm afternoon. Every sensory detail, the smell of wet soil, the touch of dew on fur, the warmth of sunlight, the soft pressure of hands offering reassurance, wove together into a tapestry of safety and belonging. He was beginning to understand that freedom was not something to fear and that trust was a gift he could give cautiously without losing himself. By evening, the field had transformed from a place of tentative exploration to a sanctuary of discovery. He chased a leaf caught in the wind, paws skimming the damp earth, tail wagging with a new confidence. Yet, whenever he paused, he looked back at me, seeking affirmation, silently asking, "Am I doing this right? Are you still here?" And I was, every time, kneeling in the soft earth, letting him know with every glance, every breath, every subtle movement that he was safe. The fragile bond had formed not in grand gestures, but in these small, deliberate moments. One sniff, one nudge, one hesitant paw at a time. When the sun finally sank below the horizon, spilling amber across the field, he rested beside me, body pressed lightly against my side, eyes half closed, breathing slow and steady. The journey from fear to this fragile comfort had been measured in the smallest of steps, each carrying more emotional weight than the last. And in that stillness, as shadows deepened and the first stars blinked into existence, I understood something profound. The rope had been broken, the tether undone, but the true work, the delicate weaving of trust, the creation of a bond strong enough to endure, was only just beginning. In the quiet twilight, with the field bathed in golden shadow, the puppy leaned against me, and I felt the first true pulse of connection, fragile yet unshakable, echoing in both of us. The morning arrived with a crisp, clean light, sharp against the edges of the field, as if the world had been scrubbed free of yesterday's shadows. The dew sparkled like fractured glass, clinging to grass and earth alike, and the air carried the faint tang of wet soil and distant wildflowers. The puppy, now freer than he had ever been, moved with a confidence that was both thrilling and tentative. Yet beneath the newfound bravery, traces of his past lingered. Sudden hesitations, flinches at unexpected sounds, and the faintest hesitation before exploring the edges of the wide, open space. Each step forward was a small triumph, each pause a reminder that growth was not linear, but a careful dance between fear and courage. We ventured farther that morning, through a narrow path that led into a thicket of trees. Shadows dappled the ground, shifting with the gentle sway of branches overhead. He froze at the first brush of a fallen leaf, ears pinned, body rigid, then slowly lowered himself, sniffing cautiously. I stayed a few feet behind, letting him navigate, letting him test the space and the sounds. The world, once vast and threatening, was now a playground of lessons. Every rustle of leaves became a challenge to conquer, every unfamiliar sent a test of bravery. He was learning, one careful paw at a time, that the world could be approached, studied, and understood without fear. A sudden noise, twigs snapping beneath a bird's landing, made him leap violently, tail tucked, ears pressed flat. My heart jumped in tandem with his, but I stayed still, soft words spilling from my lips, grounding him with presence rather than movement. Slowly, he lowered his body, sniffing the spot where the noise had erupted, eyes flicking to me for reassurance. I could see the tension draining from his limbs, the shiver in his fur easing as he processed the event and realized no harm had come. The triumph was subtle but profound. He had faced a sudden threat and remained, alive and curious, choosing to observe rather than flee. We continued along the trail, passing patches of sun-warmed moss and puddles reflecting the sky. He paused at a shallow stream, sniffing the water cautiously, pawing at its surface, then leaping back with a startled bark. I knelt beside him, letting my hand hover near the water, not to force him, but to offer the reassurance of presence. Eventually, he stepped in, tentative at first, testing the cool rush of liquid against his fur. He drank carefully, eyes alert, then looked back at me, tail wagging with that small, quivering excitement that comes from mastering a new challenge. Each success, no matter how minor it seemed to the world, was monumental in his journey, and I felt it deeply, my chest tightening with both pride and relief. The afternoon sun climbed higher, spilling gold through the thinning canopy, and we reached a small clearing. Here the field opened fully, the grass soft underfoot, and the puppy hesitated at the edges. His gaze swept the horizon, cautious, ears twitching, tail flicking lightly. Yet something had changed. He no longer sought the rope, the tether, the protection of restraint. He sniffed at the air, then sprinted a short distance, skimming the grass, fur catching the sunlight, eyes bright and alive. The sound of paws on earth, once so hesitant and strained, now carried rhythm and purpose. Each bound, each leap was a declaration of triumph over his former fear, a celebration of his resilience and newly discovered courage. A sudden gust of wind swept through the clearing, rustling the trees and carrying the scent of wildflowers. He froze for a heartbeat, then barked once, joyously, a clear, unpracticed sound that seemed to resonate with the entire field. I laughed softly, breathless, watching him chase the wind, ears flapping, tail high, as though challenging the air itself to scare him. For a brief moment, the shadow of the rope, the chains of his past, the hesitation of every earlier step, they all dissolved, leaving only a creature delighting in the joy of movement and freedom. And yet, whenever he paused, he looked back, seeking affirmation, acknowledging the bond that had allowed him to reach this moment. By late afternoon, the sun dipped low, painting the clearing in amber and rose. We stopped near a small patch of moss, and he curled beside me, chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. His eyes glimmered with tired satisfaction, reflecting the fading light, and I could see the pride in his small form, the quiet triumph over a world that had tried to break him. Every trial, the snapped twig, the rushing water, the gust of wind, had become a step in his growth, each conquered moment layering confidence atop caution, bravery atop hesitation. He had faced fear, tested his boundaries, and discovered the strength to overcome. As shadows lengthened and the field grew quiet, the wind softened to a gentle caress, and the world seemed to hold its breath in recognition of what had been achieved. He lifted his head, ears alert, tail wagging in small, careful arcs, and I saw the first glimmer of pure joy without fear. He had learned not only to survive, but to thrive, embracing the challenges of the world while still choosing connection. Each glance back at me was no longer a plea or a question. It was a gesture of acknowledgement, a celebration of trust and mutual understanding. And in that moment, as the sky melted into deep gold and violet, the puppy bounded across the clearing one last time, spinning, sniffing, leaping with a freedom that was hard-won and deeply deserved. He paused, just for a heartbeat, to glance back at me, eyes shining with exhilaration and gratitude, tail wagging in rhythmic clarity. The trials of the day, the lessons of fear and courage, had culminated in a moment of triumph so profound it left me breathless. The field, once a place of uncertainty, had become a stage for resilience, growth, and the delicate, joyful manifestation of a spirit once tethered, now soaring. Even as the evening settled, shadows stretching long across the grass, he stayed close, not out of fear, but by choice. His body relaxed, ears forward, tail curling with gentle pride, and in that quiet, golden light, I understood the depth of what had occurred. The fragile bond we had begun in hesitation had strengthened through trials, had transformed fear into courage, and had created a foundation sturdy enough to withstand the unknown challenges still ahead. The rope had vanished, but its lessons lingered, now reshaped into strength, trust, and triumph. And as the sun slipped beneath the horizon, leaving the clearing bathed in soft twilight, he curled beside me, chest rising and falling in a rhythm of newfound certainty, and I realized that this day, with all its trials and small victories, had been more than a test. It had been the forging of a bond that neither fear nor the shadows of the past could undo. In the quiet, golden half-light, the puppy lay beside me, free in body, courageous in spirit, and tethered only by the invisible thread of trust that had grown between us. A fragile bond now strong enough to carry both of us forward into whatever came next. The morning air was soft and cool, carrying the subtle scent of damp earth and flowering grass, a quiet testament to the night's passing rain. The field stretched wide, golden with sunlight and flecked with shadows, and the puppy moved through it with an ease I had never seen before. He paused at the crest of a small hill, ears pricked, tail flicking gently, surveying the expanse with a confidence tempered by instinct. Yet even in this newfound freedom, he lifted his gaze back to me, and in that look, I felt the full weight of his journey. Fear transformed into trust, pain reshaped into cautious joy, hesitation braided with boldness. He had chosen to return his gaze, and in that choice lay a depth of meaning I could scarcely put into words. For weeks, the world had been a series of tests. Sudden noises, unfamiliar terrain, shallow streams, rustling leaves that once provoked flinches and hesitation. Each challenge had left its mark, and each triumph had layered strength upon uncertainty. Now standing in the warmth of morning, He was no longer the trembling shadow tethered to a rope. He was a being reborn in small victories, forged in the crucible of patience and gentle care. His eyes, bright and glistening, scanned the horizon, yet always returned to mine, a tether invisible but unbreakable, a silent affirmation that he understood the bond we had nurtured. I approached slowly, letting him watch, letting him decide whether I belonged to this sunlit world as a presence or remained a figure from which caution was still warranted. He sniffed the air, body low at first, then lifted, tail curling with confidence, paws sinking into the soft earth as he moved forward. The breeze carried scents of grass and wildflowers, a faint trace of mud and dew clinging to fur, and the sunlight caught each strand, illuminating a coat that now glimmered with vitality rather than neglect. He paused midway, turned, and met my gaze direct. There was no fear, no tentative question, only the serene acknowledgement of a soul that had survived and learned to trust. I knelt beside him, hands extended gently, and he pressed his head lightly against my palm, a small, deliberate gesture that carried all the weight of his journey. The field seemed to exhale with us, the wind softening, sunlight warming our shared space, and the distant hum of life, the birds, the insects, the whisper of leaves, composed a quiet symphony for this moment of connection. He moved closer, brushing his body against mine, tail sweeping in arcs of contentment, and I felt the full depth of what had been accomplished. A fragile life, once tethered and wary, had chosen love and trust, and in doing so had transformed the world around him. We wandered together through the field, the morning light shifting in golden pools over damp earth, highlighting the tiny trembles of his paws and the slow, steady rise of his chest. He explored, yet always returned, eyes flicking back, glimmering with curiosity and joy, each glance an affirmation of our shared history. The rope, the chains of neglect and fear, had vanished completely, yet I could see its imprint in the way he measured the world, now reshaped into cautious bravery and conscious freedom. Every sniff, every leap, every soft bark carried the poetry of survival, the music of trust, and the quiet triumph of being alive without constraint. As we reached the edge of the field, where the golden grass met a small patch of trees, he paused, sniffing the cool shadow beneath the canopy. I stayed still, letting him choose, and after a moment, he turned, eyes meeting mine once more. And that gaze was a story spanning weeks, nights of trembling, days of hesitant trust, the discovery of courage in the smallest moments. It was a gaze that spoke louder than any words could, carrying gratitude, recognition, and the unspoken promise of companionship. He stepped toward me fully, head raised, tail wagging with measured exuberance, and pressed against my side in a gesture both gentle and full of unrestrained emotion. The world around us seemed to soften with his acceptance, the sunlight bathing the clearing in amber, the wind carrying scents and whispers of life renewed. He moved freely now, exploring the boundaries of his existence with confidence. Yet each exploration ended with a return to the gaze he had first offered weeks ago. It was not a look of dependency, but of connection, the quiet understanding that freedom and trust could coexist, that love did not bind but liberated. The field, once a place of fear and isolation, had become a sanctuary of shared triumphs, a stage for the culmination of small victories that had led to profound, lasting transformation. Hours passed, but time seemed suspended in the delicate rhythm of our companionship. He rolled in a patch of soft grass, fur gleaming in sunlight, ears flicking with joy, tail curling and uncurling, then paused to glance back at me, eyes shining with a clarity that was almost sacred. I felt a swell of emotion in my chest, a mixture of awe and relief, as I realized that the journey had reached its full arc. From tethered shadow to free spirit, from fear to joy, from hesitation to choice. He had returned his gaze not out of necessity, but out of deliberate understanding, a conscious recognition of the bond that had carried him through every trial. As the sun began to dip, painting the sky in strokes of rose and gold, he sat beside me, paws tucked under, body relaxed, breathing slow and steady. The light touched the tips of his fur, illuminating each strand, each subtle twitch of muscle, each quiver of life fully embraced. He leaned against me lightly, eyes half closed, yet every so often lifting to meet my gaze, a ritual of trust reaffirmed. The field, once harsh and imposing, had become a testament to patience, to love offered quietly and without demand. In that golden light, in the serenity of his return gaze, I understood the quiet poetry of his journey. A life once constrained, now chosen, a soul once tethered, now free, yet always mindful of the bond that had made freedom meaningful. And finally, as twilight settled and shadows softened, he rose, stretched and turned once more toward me, eyes glimmering with a joy that was patient, earned, and unshakable. The wind carried the scent of damp earth and growing grass, the horizon glowed with soft fading light, and the field seemed to hold us in a gentle, eternal embrace. He trotted forward, then glanced back again, a single deliberate return of the gaze that had begun our story weeks ago, a look that spoke of courage, trust, love, and the quiet, profound certainty that even in a vast, unpredictable world, some bonds endure, transform, and illuminate the soul. In that final, luminous moment, I realized the journey had completed its full circle. The rope was gone, the shadow dissolved, and yet the bond remained, steadfast and luminous, carried in eyes that had learned to trust, in a heart that had learned to leap, and in the quiet, golden light of a field where freedom and love had finally converged.